Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Jewish Council for Public Affairs webinar. My name is Karen Kasner, and I live in New York City. I am a board member and a pro-board member of JCPA. JCPA is the network for 125 Jewish community relation councils and 17 national organizations. We are committed to bringing you important information, stimulating discussions, sound strategic advice, and critical advocacy opportunities, all while you are holed up at home. The webinar today is the first installment. Please take a moment after this webinar to answer a few questions so we may determine what kind of webinars, webcasts, and discussions to bring you in the future. These are indeed strange and challenging times. I hope that each and every one of you is managing well and helping others manage well. Time like this, we stress test our most cherished values. Who are we as human beings? Who are we as Jews? What do we stand for? Do we need to rethink our basic values or reorder them? Might we come out stronger and more unified than before? And I can tell you from personal times here in New York, having faced 9/11, Superstorm Sandy, and obviously personal challenges each of us have, we will come out stronger. I also want to urge you just to reach out to your network, family, friends, your federation, your JCRC, JCPA, and other organizations to touch base if you need any additional resources or know somebody who does. When our existential reality shifts so rapidly, we need to make sense of this and define a path forward that helps us think and act towards our fellow human beings. We turn to trusted and proven voices who can help us in sense making. This reminds us of what we know, what we've been through, and help us apply those knowledges to challenging and changing circumstances. And as I said, they will make us more resilient. I am so delighted that we have with us Rabbi David Wolpe of Temple Sinai in Los Angeles. He was named by Newsweek as the most influential American rabbi. He is both brilliant and humane. Thank you, Rabbi Wolpe, for lending us your voice today. David Bernstein, JCPA CEO and President, will now interview Rabbi Wolpe. Thank you again all for joining us, and stay safe and stay well.
Thank you, Karen, very much. Rabbi, I really appreciate you doing this and being with our network today. We couldn't ask for a more important voice in these times, so thank you.
I'm happy to be here. I'm sorry it took me so long. 3 different computers before we finally got it to work, but now it's working.
I'm glad we made it happen. So the first question, and I'm going to invite, by the way, our viewers to try to ask questions in their question chat box. We'll do our best to get at them. But let me start with this. How would you describe this current existential moment for humanity and for the Jewish people?
Well, it's unprecedented in our lifetimes, not unprecedented in history, although technology certainly makes it our reactions to it different than they have ever been. Remember that we now know what's going on all over the world. That certainly wasn't true, for example, in the Spanish flu or in previous pandemics. However, the human fear and the possible social consequences are not so different. When you read about the Black Plague, if you read, for example, Barbara Tuchman's book, The Distant Mirror, you hear how people were distancing themselves from one another, were hoarding things, all sorts of superstition, which today we call fake news, arose. And I think that this goes to, at bottom, not only our fear of death, but our fear of isolation, which are, I think, the 2 greatest human fears: to be lonely, and to die.
Yes, and I know just from my own experience, everybody around me, including myself, are very anxious, and and I think it helps us to have a sense of why that's so. And some of what we're called to do is quite physical in nature. We're told we have to stay home. We're told we have to wash our hands. We're told we shouldn't breathe or sneeze on people, stay away 6 feet away from people. But it seems that there's a series of value choices that confront us, and I'm not sure what they are, and perhaps you can help us think those through. What are some of the value choices we're going to have as Jews and as human beings in the coming days ahead?
So at least part of the value choice is how much is the choice of to what extent do you take care of you and yours, and to what extent do you mind the needs of society? So if you walk into the supermarket and you see there are 20 rolls of toilet paper left, do you take all 20? Or do you take 10 knowing that the person behind you needs 10? And that is a simple example, and toilet paper has become a sort of paradigmatic symbol of societal panic these days, even though it is hardly in short supply in general. But it does remind us that we're all going to have to make those sorts of choices. How much charity are you going to give when your stock portfolio has just plummeted? How much are you going to be willing to share with the poor, the hungry, the homeless? How much are you going to help people, elders in your own community? We're trying to set up a group of people to bring food, for example, to those who are elderly and those who are shut-ins. How much are people going to do that, or are they going to worry about their own, themselves and their families exclusively? And those sorts of questions will really determine, far more than any medical test, the quality of our society. Are we going to fall apart, or are we going to pull together? And I don't think that there will be one overarching answer to this. The answer is in some ways, some parts, some of us will fall apart and others pull together. But the more voices we have saying together we get through this better than we do in a selfish hoarding mode, the more I think the society will be healthy, not only short term, but in the long run, because this will be over one day, and we will be much better off if we don't have to look back in shame at how we behaved.
So some of these trade-offs between our individual interests and the social interests might actually create a tension. I was talking to a board member of ours yesterday who happens to be a doctor in his 70s, still very active in his practice, is going to clinics, and there's no doubt he's going to be on the front lines here. Yet he's taking certain risks to himself. What is that? How should we regard that tension between keeping ourselves safe and helping others?
So the Jewish tradition tells us that responsibility goes in concentric circles. Your first responsibility is to yourself and your family. The second to your immediate community. The third to a wider circle of your neighborhood, city, on and on and on. And, and I think for each of us, there's going to have to be a weighing and a balance. You will obviously care most about what's happening immediately around you, but as a society, if we don't show that we are broadly concerned, then I think it has negative consequences in two ways. First of all, there are physical consequences. So for example, as has been said now by several people, younger people who are both at much less risk and also have this sort of evolutionary feeling of immortality, if they continue to gather at bars, at beaches, at wherever they can, and come together and spread the virus among them, and then go home to people who are older, that will argue for a level of social irresponsibility that has real consequences, society-wide. So you have to keep in mind both your own health and also the general social health, because when it comes to a virus, the world really is one. You know, you may or may not like globalism, but when it comes to a virus, we're a global community.
Yes. So, some of us
I
are
can't hear
involved
you.
in volunteer efforts. There might be seniors in our neighborhood who might need extra help with groceries or medicine. The other day I was passing out some flyers, and I found myself touching mailboxes and wondering if somebody else had touched those mailboxes. Are we? To what degree do we put ourselves at risk, though? Even as individuals, we're not in the medical profession. We're not sort of expected to be there to help people in the same way as doctors and nurses might be. Are we commanded to go beyond our comfort zone there and even what's risky to ourselves?
So, I mean, there was an article, I believe it was in the Wall Street Journal, about the
I'm having
heroic
trouble
doctors
hearing you, Rabbi.
of Wuhan.
Yeah.
And they were quite remarkable, what they have done. I'm sorry, I don't know what to do about that. You tell me what to do about that. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I hear you.
Okay.
Just a little delay.
So there was an article, I believe it was in the Wall Street Journal, about the doctors of Wuhan and how they were sacrificing their lives, quite literally, in order to save patients by taking on an enormous viral load, seeing one patient after another. Now, as you say, that's a degree of self-sacrifice that is not called for most of us. But I think most of us, we are as careful as we can be. We wash our hands and wipe wipe down surfaces and do all of that. But you can't, there is no perfect safety, not in the world and not in a virus. And so are we taking risks by associating with anybody else? Yes. But is that part of the inevitable human condition? Yes. I don't think that the proper response to this is never to see anyone and never to touch anything. So if you're bringing food into your house, you don't know who's touched the food, and you can wipe it down and you can do all those things. But nonetheless, there is an extent to which we just need to be able to live even in very, very perilous times.
Yes.
I can't hear you.
In addition to these challenging personal choices and ethical dilemmas we might face, I think many of us are struck. Okay, how's this now? Do you hear? Do you hear?
No, I can hear you through the computer, not through the phone. Through the computer, but not through the phone.
How's that? Okay. So there's a bit of a delay. Do you hear me now? So let's keep doing that. You don't hear?
Now I can. Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, all right. I guess there was a delay there. All right. So in addition to these challenging, again. I'm going to switch to computer audio and see if that helps.
Do you hear me?
Do you hear me?
I hear you, but there's a lag between your talking and what I hear. It's still working, David. There's just a lag.
Okay, all right, let's try this.
So keep talking.
All right, in addition to the ethical dilemmas that we face as individuals, it seems to me that we also face an emotional dilemma as well. How should we regard this? What is the balance between being vigilant and panicking? How do you talk to congregants? How do you talk to people about their feelings during this time and how to go about and manage their anxiety and stress?
So first of all, I mean, part of this is the constitution of the individual. I'm constitutionally an optimist. I have to force myself to take dire warnings seriously because my assumption is always everything is going to be okay, which both is not true and also tends to be infuriating to other people when you say everything's going to be okay. And so I think that part of it is we have to be aware of how we normally react to things in the world. And if you know that your normal reaction is always dire, everything's going to be bad, then you have to self-correct for it. As I have to self-correct for my normal reaction that everything's fine and we're going to be okay. And therefore, I've tried to be exceptionally vigilant. I literally, when I bought things at the grocery store, I brought it home and I wiped it all down because that's not normally my way of being, but I'm trying to listen and pay attention. And I think that the best way to react to this is clinically as opposed to emotionally. That is, what should I do as opposed to how should I feel? Because we can't feel our way through a pandemic. It doesn't matter to the virus whether you feel panicky or you feel optimistic. It matters how you conduct yourself and what you do. And also, panic tends to blunt the moral instincts. And we don't want to do that now because we have to project the time when this will be over and we'll look back on how we behaved. So my advice to people is to try to focus much more on what you're doing than how you're feeling, and to remember that when this is over, you want to feel, if not proud of yourself, at least not uncomfortable with yourself. And also, I think it's really important that we continue to, from every platform we have, to tell people to take this seriously. The single most dangerous social meme is, this is really a hoax, it's not such a big deal, we'll all be okay. Look at only, I put that in air quotes, only a certain number of people, only a certain number of people have died thus far, all of that. And in fact, we know that all you have to do is look at the statistics. As the old statistical sort of brain teaser has it, if you have a pond and you put a lily in that pond and it doubles every day, that lily doubles every single day. And on day 48, the pond is covered. On what day is it half covered? And the answer, of course, is day 47. It's half covered. And that's how epidemics work. That is, one day it seems like we can handle it, and the next day, all of a sudden, it's overwhelming. So you can't just judge by what you see or by what exists now. You also have to judge by extrapolation, and that's why people have to be so careful.
Yes, thank you. I know there's going to be delayed still, so you'll hear me. What are the ways that we can become stronger from this? How do we sort of mobilize our communities, our synagogues, our friends, so that when we're done with all this, we emerge stronger than we were before, and that we turn a crisis into an opportunity for a stronger, more resilient society?
So it does occur to me that the delay is sort of symbolic. It's like our reaction to the disease, you know? The disease is still ahead of us and we haven't yet caught up with where it should be. The best ways that I have seen that communities are handling this is, first of all, to switch to what we're doing right now, that is create online communities. So in our synagogue, we're putting classes online. All of our services are online. Morning and afternoon minyan are online. You can download the Siddur and there's a virtual prayer book online. In other words, try to do as much as you can to keep people engaged and feeling like they're still part of a community, even though that crucial physical contact for the time being has to be suspended. The second thing you can do is remind people how much wisdom there is in the tradition that helps people deal with this. Because as I said, this is not the first time that Judaism has faced a pandemic. Most famously, in 1848, the Rabbi Yisrael Salanter ordered his congregation to eat on Yom Kippur because pikuach nefesh, which is the saving of a life, it comes before almost any other value. And therefore, our actions ought to be as far as we can stretch the tradition in order to accommodate the necessity of social distancing, or I like better physical distancing, because I don't want to distance socially, I want to distance physically. Physical distancing that will still allow us to have the sort of connection that we're having right now, which is we're having a conversation with, I don't know, well over 1,000, maybe 2,000 people. And this conversation is entirely because we can't all be in the same room. And these sorts of efforts are crucial so that people won't feel as though the whole world has fallen apart and they've been forgotten. And the other piece of this is that if you can get people as part of a, there are, when I marry couples, I always comment or often comment on the fact that they sometimes stand looking at each other and they sometimes stand both looking at me, looking in the same direction. So looking at each other is the social grouping. And that's what we're trying to do with the services and so on. Looking in the same direction are the social services we're providing for those in need. That is, joint projects and programs that people can still do, even though the synagogue may not be open. That is, feeding those who are hungry or homeless, or calling, we're setting up phone trees to call people who are scared or alone or don't have family. Those sorts of social programs, knowing we're both doing them, we're doing virtual Bikur Cholim, we're visiting people who are sick by calling them or FaceTiming them. All of those sorts of things we have to do together, and they make us feel as though we are still in this, not as isolated people scurrying off to the market to get our paper towels, but as a Jewish community that is responding to a worldwide crisis.
Thank you. So I'm taking a question from one of the viewers who says, I think it's inconceivable that a dozen or more people can gather safely 3 weeks from now for Pesach, for Passover. What are we supposed to do about Passover? What are you telling your congregants how to think about Passover? Are we telling people to cancel Seders, delay Seders, do Seders virtually? What are some of the options we have here?
I think if you do a Seder, you do it with very, very, very few people, just a few people, just immediate family. I've told people to cancel their 70-person Seders. And we're going to do one virtually for people to join through the synagogue. And I think that those right now are our only options. You can still open the door for Elijah, even though he's in the high-risk group after all, because being thousands and thousands of years old, he's clearly going to be vulnerable to the virus. But you can still open the door, but you should do it with very few people sitting around the table. Again, you have to take this really seriously, seriously enough that you don't say, well, it's Passover, because you want there to be another Passover. So how else are you going to, how else are you going to do it?
Thank you. So 2 related questions from a viewer. What can we do as a community to support lower income people, Jews and non-Jews, who will be harmed the most by the economic fallout this week and during this period? What responsibility do Jewish organizations that close down have, not only to their salaried employees, but to their hourly contract employees as well?
This is a very difficult question, and part of it has to do with what your particular situation is. So, look, we're going to see a lot of businesses go out of business, and that's going to be very painful. Small businesses, mom and pop shops, little restaurants, they may not be able to sustain the economic loss that this is inevitably going to bring. So there is certainly a responsibility, as there is for the government in general, but for Jewish communal organizations in particular, to try to sustain and help such businesses to the extent that we can. So I'll give you one of many examples. We're trying to arrange for some kosher catering to be able to be picked up at the synagogue so that the kosher caterer will be able to make some money and people will be able to get food, but obviously there's no going to restaurants. Creative solutions like that, trying to buy things from vendors that you know, trying to get some funds together for sustaining people during this time. I think it's a crucial Jewish obligation. The tamchui, which is sort of the communal plate, existed in every Jewish community that ever was organized, and we certainly in our day have enough collective wealth that we can help a lot of people through this tough time. But I want to just address the heart of the dilemma, which is that psychological economic distress and real economic distress are not the same thing. So if somebody is very wealthy and they've just lost 20% of their wealth, they're still very wealthy. And even though psychologically it makes it harder to give because you've just lost a lot of your wealth, if we changed the internal standard to not how the numbers feel to me, but the reality in the world, I think we would look at it very differently. The fact that you can sustain this kind of loss and still be very wealthy means you were extravagantly wealthy to start with. And when I say something like this, what I discover is that almost everybody who hears it thinks I'm talking about someone else. For a lot of people listening to this, I'm talking about you. You have a lot more money than 99 point whatever % of people through human history. And to think that you can't give a little bit more than you used to help people who are really in serious straits is, I think, a mistake. And it's a psychological mistake. It's not an economic mistake. It's a mistake about how you feel about wealth. It's not a mistake about how the amount of the number in your bank balance. So we really have to reconceive our sense of what it means to give at desperate times, because I'm not asking somebody to go without another meal. If that's what it means, you shouldn't do it. But if what it means is the next time I look at my balance, I won't feel so good, then I just remind you of that wonderful story of the guy who comes before the Kadosh Baruch Hu. He comes before God in heaven, and God says, "How much did you give to charity?" And the guy says, "I didn't really give, but here, I'll write you a check." And God says, "Oh no, up here in heaven, we only accept receipts."
Yes, thank you for that. I think that we're going to have to be able to talk to our community about that in these times. So one question from a viewer: the elderly are the most at risk of social isolation, and at the same time, they may be the least technologically savvy. I know my mom, who I talked to, who should be on this call, was on her ladies' stock club on Zoom for the first time, but she knows how to use a computer, but a lot of people don't. And how do we make sure that we're dealing with the elderly population? I have to tell you, we've gotten a number of questions here about that. How are you dealing with this? How are you thinking about it, and how might we think about
it? The elderly, as you said, are clearly the most vulnerable, need our support and need our help. The way that we're thinking about it is to try to enable them to have both the resources that they need and also to feel like they're not forgotten. Because the elderly that have family that are taking care of them are much better off, as you say, than those that are sick and alone. And there are a lot who are sick and alone. And so phone trees are important. They really are. Those who can do FaceTime, that's even better, so that they can see someone. And even if somebody could set them up with FaceTime, that would be very helpful. But also, we have to be extremely careful about their health. Now, part of the reality of what's going on in certain parts of the world, I know that some of your viewers are aware of this, is that, for example, in Italy, there's triage. That is, depending on how sick someone is and how old they are, they decide what level of medical care they're going to get. God forbid that should have to happen here. I hope not, but part of the way that you avoid that is by taking this virus seriously. It returns to what I said before. In some ways, the best thing you can do for that old person who may be alone is to make sure that they don't get sick. So the more that we flatten the curve of the virus, the better chance they have of living through this, which is, of course, the bottom line of what it is that we're trying to accomplish. So I think that you reach out as much as you can. If you're aware of someone in your neighborhood, in your community, who's alone, call them, ask them what they need. Most people will be willing to help. If somebody called you and said, I know someone who needs a couple cans of food, if you go to the market, will you give me a couple of cans for them? We'll do it. One of the things we know psychologically, and this is important for your viewers to know and understand, is human beings react much better to one story than they do to numbers. This is so true that there have even been studies done that if you get somebody to feel bad for a girl who is starving, and then you add more people, and you make a group of 10 people who are starving, even though she may be one of them, their empathy starts to drop. We're just so wired that we respond better to one than to many. And so anytime you can enunciate someone's specific problem, you have a much better chance of getting a reaction than if you just say, there are lots of people in need, please give. So if you know a story, tell the story. And if you know someone who can help, tell the individual story for the person who can help. Because right now, what we need is for people to respond.
Yes. So you raised the issue of those doctors in Italy having to make difficult decisions. There's going to be doctors, including many Jewish doctors, who could be in that situation. I don't know about your reading of the data, but it seems that even if we do everything right, there's still going to be some of those very morally tough decisions coming up. I have cousins who are doctors in New York City who are getting ready psychologically to face those decisions. What do you tell them? What do you tell them about how do you order? How do you set priorities of who lives and who dies?
That's an impossible question, but one that, as you point out, it's not fair to duck because rabbis and others will be faced with it. Rather, doctors and others will be faced with it. And so I don't think rabbis are allowed to keep silent on it, even though I don't pretend to any special insight. I remember my father, who was a rabbi in Harrisburg when they had the first dialysis machine. And they had one in the entire city of Harrisburg. And they came to him and asked him to be on a panel to decide who would get dialysis. And that was basically issuing a death sentence to those who wouldn't. And at first he didn't want to do it. But then a friend of his said, well, someone's going to do it. So why shouldn't you be part of the voice of people who decide? And so I think from the Jewish tradition, we have to give two contradictory pieces of advice, which are, first of all, in absolute terms, no life is worth more than any other life. A 20-year-old life is not worth more than an 80-year-old life. In absolute terms, an image of God is an image of God is an image of God. Having said that, though, there are people who have the potential for longer lives, who have more possibility, or who have more people relying on them. And all those sorts of calculations will have to play a role if there are limited medical resources. We know that right now. And so someone who is lying in the hospital who is 90, and someone who is lying in the hospital who is 20, and both of them are competing for the same resources. I think as a society, we have no choice but to say that if we can save the 20-year-old, we should do so. Doctors sotto voce, that is, under their breaths, make this decision all the time, even though they don't like to talk about it, because the truth is that medicine, like everything else, is a limited resource. And so from a religious point of view, you can't make an absolute distinction. But from a societal point of view, you can't avoid making those distinctions. And all I can say is that if doctors, as sometimes happens in my own case, and I'm sure in the case of other rabbis, if doctors want advice or counsel or someone to listen to, we are certainly available to talk to them about it. And I do not envy the decisions that they may have to make, or the pain that it will cause to them and to families on all sides of this decision. But that's the reality of where we are, and I think that is also part of the human condition. We make choices every single day. Everybody knows that you could drive 20 miles an hour and there would be fewer deaths in car crashes than if you're allowed to drive 50 or 60 miles an hour. We do make social choices about the worth of life. That's not the same as religious statements about the worth of life.
So we know that there will be some deaths, unfortunately. Hopefully fewer deaths than where some of the projections might hold. But that means that there's going to be Jewish people who die, and there's going to be funerals, and there's going to be Shiva. This comes from one of the viewers. What do we do about it? I mean, Jews create social connection during times of death to comfort the bereaved. How do we think about that in these times?
It recurs to the same as the Passover question. We have already dealt with this. We have had virtual Shivas. We've had funerals where only the immediate family will attend, and no one else is permitted to do it, and they're graveside, and they are brief, and we save memorial services and so on for when this is over. We don't have a choice. We wish we did, but remember that there's something profoundly ironic and painful at the idea that you could go to a funeral to honor the dead and as a result contract a virus that is killing people. And so, yes, that is what we do, and it is what we should do, except that right now the conditions make it impossible. And I suppose the sort of brief summary of this is, if you want to live another day in order to create those conditions for the Jewish people, then you have to suspend those conditions today. And God knows we wish that weren't true. And for the people, for example, whose bar and bat mitzvahs are canceled or postponed, which is happening all over the country, or whose weddings are postponed, or happening with a tiny group of people when they had planned a huge celebration. This is painful and this is real, but we have to remember that those things, as difficult as they are still better than lying in an ICU or having somebody you love lie in an ICU fighting for their life because you went to a celebration or you joined a crowd and you contracted a virus and you or someone you love became very, very sick.
So this question comes from William Daroff, who is the CEO of the Conference of Presidents. He said, you know, Rabbi Wolpe, you're quite prolific on Twitter. What role do you see social media playing during these times?
Well, I just want to say, first of all, William Daroff is the number one Jewish, he's number one in the Jewish Twitterati, and a precious national Jewish resource, and a fellow vegan, and I hope he's washing his hands a lot. So I think social media actually has a negative and a very positive function. The negative function, of course, is that those of us on Twitter sometimes both gin up the panic and say unkind things about one another. And both of those things are bad, especially at a time of social dislocation and when there's already enough panic in the society. And instant reactions are not always not always laudable or worthy. But it's also a fantastic tool to spread information and humor and insight and encouragement. And if you use social media to do those things, God bless you. I've learned an awful lot, not only from what people have written on Facebook or Twitter or even Instagram or any social media, but also by links they have shared, articles that I would not have known about, clips from news conferences that help us understand where we are. And also sometimes, and this is one of the wonderful things about social media, scrolling a Twitter feed is in some ways like browsing a bookstore. That is, you come across things you never would have expected. And so it has brought me into different places. People are starting book groups and they're asking each other questions about what they're doing. And I'm writing an article that's going to come out in the forward, for example, about books that you can read at this time when people are stuck at home in all sorts of different areas. Those kinds of things that we share with each other, they're wonderful, and they bring you in touch with people all over the world. I get reactions, as does everyone, I think, who's active on social media, on both my Facebook page and on Twitter, from places I've never seen, never visited, sometimes never known of, and people have wonderful, interesting things to say. This is the way that you bring the world into your room when you can't leave your room to go into the world.
Beautiful. I think we'll go with one last question here. So there's, as you said at the very beginning, there are people still in sort of denial about what's happening. They claim it's a hoax. They haven't sort of moved on from that mindset. But we're talking about a matter of 2 or 3 weeks, and where we'll see in many parts of the country some serious situations. And and one of our viewers says that might be an interesting analog to climate change, that most of us don't see it happening right in front of us, although I'm sure that there are those who can look at their farms or their local climates and see changes. How do we use this as an opportunity to talk about climate change and the long-term effects that it has on humanity?
I think that it is in some ways exactly as you said, an analogy in the sense that there are things that we can't see, that aren't palpable to us, that in fact are of crucial importance to the future of the world. And so climate change is obviously premier among those. And if this gives people a way of understanding that invisible processes, well, the processes themselves are invisible, their results are not, that invisible processes could be dangerous and even cataclysmic, then the virus will have served a very powerful purpose. Look, some good will come out of this. Maybe a lot of good will come out of this. The key factor in every crisis and every loss is not that you're glad the loss happened, but what do you do given that you've had this loss? So given that the virus has happened, if it wakens the world to greater action on climate change, that will be a blessing, even though we don't want there to be a worldwide virus in order for that to happen. If it teaches people how easily transmitted diseases are and gets more people to be careful or to inoculate themselves during flu season, or to take care of the elderly, or to be vigilant in different ways, that's a good thing, even though we don't want the virus in order for that to happen. But remember that, since you said this is the last question, let me end with a Jewish story. So if you go to the Israel Museum, you can see there the oldest fragment of Torah that exists in the world. There are 2 rolled up silver amulets that were found in the valley of Hinnom outside the walls of Jerusalem. If you know Jewish tradition, you know that that valley, Gehenna, is the Jewish word for hell, because that was where the Canaanites sacrificed children. And the Jews thought that that was hell. So these amulets were found in Gehinom right around the time of the destruction of the first temple, so around 586 BCE. They were found about 25 years ago, and when they unrolled them, they found inside the Birkat Kohanim, Yivarechecha Hashem v'yishmerecha, Ye'er Hashem panav elecha v'yichunecha, Yisa Hashem panav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom. May God bless you and keep you. May God's countenance shine upon you and be gracious to you. May God be with you and grant you peace. In other words, the oldest bit of Torah we have is a blessing rescued from hell. And that's what we do. That's what our tradition teaches us. When something terrible happens, we look to maximize the blessing. To everybody who's watching and to everybody beyond, I wish you safety and good health, and try to find the blessing in the midst of this desperate and difficult time.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. I'm so happy that we've had this chance to think through some of these issues with you. We needed a framework, and I think you've helped us begin the process of creating one. So we'll look to you for some of your great writing and hopefully your voice as well in the coming days and months. And we're so very appreciative.
Thank you so much.
Thank you to all our viewers for being with us, and you're going to hear more from us. We're going to be trying to do as many of these webinars as we possibly can, thinking through some of the moral choices, the strategic choices. How do we function as a community? How do we build bridges in challenging times with other communities as well? So please join us. Please take a second to fill out the survey so we know what you're interested in. And in the meantime, wish you a good and productive and healthy week. Thanks, everyone. Be well.